The courtroom was filled with a sense of tension that could be felt in the air, almost like the building was holding its breath. This wasn't just any trial. It was a big case that had drawn attention from both the public and the media. There were reporters in the back, scribbling notes, and spectators in the gallery, some of whom had come to watch the drama unfold. Everyone was aware that this was going to be an important day, and they didn't want to miss a single moment. At the center of it all was the judge, an older man with years of experience in the courtroom. He had seen it all. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the room. He was known for being tough but fair, a stickler for the rules, and someone who didn't tolerate disruptions. His reputation had earned him both respect and a little fear from lawyers and defendants alike. People didn't dare to cross him, knowing that his patience had its limits. On the other side of the courtroom, the defense lawyer was getting ready to speak. He was young, maybe in his late 30s, with a sharp suit and a confident air about him. He had a reputation for being a fast talker, and was known for pushing boundaries when it came to arguing his cases. He didn't hesitate to take risks, which often worked in his favor, but it also meant he wasn't afraid to get a little too bold at times. Today, however, he was determined to impress. His voice was steady as he prepared to present his argument to the court, but there was something in the air that felt a little off, something that would soon change everything. The case was about a complicated situation involving a high-profile figure, and emotions were running high. The prosecution had already laid out its side, and now it was the defense's turn to speak. The defense lawyer, looking confident, leaned forward and began to argue. His tone was smooth, his words sharp. He was laying out his case, trying to poke holes in the prosecution's argument. It was clear that he believed his points were strong and well thought out, but as he spoke, something unexpected happened. The judge, who had been listening attentively, raised his hand, signaling that he wanted to say something. The courtroom fell silent, everyone turning their attention toward the judge. Normally, when the judge interrupted, it was to correct a misstatement or clarify something important. But today, the interruption was different. Before the judge could even finish his sentence, the defense lawyer spoke up again, almost as if he didn't hear the request to pause. He immediately began talking over the judge, his voice rising just a little, trying to make his point before the judge could stop him. It wasn't uncommon for lawyers to get carried away when they felt strongly about a case, but this was different. The defense lawyer was interrupting the judge in front of everyone, and that was something no one in the courtroom expected. The judge's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, a silence settled over the room. Everyone could feel the tension. It was a game of power. Who had control of the room? Was it the judge, the one in charge, or was it the defense lawyer, pushing the limits of what was acceptable in a courtroom? The judge cleared his throat, his voice suddenly firm and commanding. "I didn't ask you to continue speaking," he said, his tone colder now. "You will wait for your turn to speak." He wasn't angry, but there was a clear edge to his words. His eyes locked onto the defense lawyer, and in that moment the courtroom seemed to shrink. It was as if the world outside had vanished, and the only thing that mattered was this exchange. The defense lawyer had overstepped, and everyone knew it. But the defense lawyer, unbothered by the judge's tone, wasn't ready to back down. He hadn't meant any disrespect, of course. He was just trying to make his argument, to defend his client as best as he could. But there was something about the judge's authority, the way he had addressed him so bluntly, that seemed to spark something in him. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was the heat of the moment, but the defense lawyer was not going to let the judge silence him without some pushback. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice rising just a bit, "I'm simply trying to make my case. I'm not here to waste anyone's time, but I believe I have the right to present my argument." The room felt even quieter now. It wasn't a loud argument, but the defiance was clear. The lawyer was standing his ground, refusing to be intimidated. The judge's eyes didn't leave him, though, and there was no mistaking the look on his face. He had no intention of letting the defense lawyer run the show. "You will respect the rules of this court," the judge said, his voice cutting through the lawyer's words. "You will speak when you are asked to speak. If you cannot follow that basic rule, there will be consequences." It was clear that the judge wasn't going to tolerate any more interruptions. The lawyer could feel the weight of those words. He tried to maintain his composure, but there was a slight shift in his posture. He had crossed a line, and it was obvious that the judge wasn't about to let it slide. The rest of the courtroom watched in silence, some shifting in their seats, others exchanging looks. It was one of those rare moments where the balance of power seemed so delicate, and no one was sure how it would play out. Would the defense lawyer apologize and back down, or would he continue to challenge the judge? For a moment, there was nothing but quiet. The defense lawyer, realizing he had taken the situation too far, seemed to hesitate. But his pride was in play now. He had made his point, and he didn't want to appear weak in front of the courtroom. "I'm simply doing my job, Your Honor," he said, his voice calmer now, but still firm. "I'm here to defend my client, and I will continue to do so in the best way I know how." The judge's eyes softened just a little, but there was no mistaking the finality in his voice when he spoke again. "You've had your chance. Now be quiet and allow the other side to present their argument." The lawyer nodded, though there was a subtle tension in the air. The judge, satisfied that the interruption had been addressed, returned his attention to the proceedings. But for everyone in the room, the moment had been a reminder of just how delicate the balance of power could be in a courtroom. One small misstep, one moment of arrogance or pride could change everything. The defense lawyer sat back down, his hands resting on the table in front of him. His face had returned to its neutral expression, but there was a small bead of sweat forming on his forehead. He knew he had to be careful now. He had just been publicly reprimanded in front of the entire room, and the rest of the trial would surely be affected by what had just happened. But what he didn't know was that this seemingly small clash with the judge would soon take a turn that no one expected, and it would change everything about how the trial would unfold. The courtroom seemed to freeze in time as the defense lawyer sat back down, his face a mask of frustration. The judge had made it clear that he wasn't going to tolerate any more interruptions, and yet the lawyer couldn't help but feel a sense of indignation. He was there to do a job, and that job wasn't going to be stopped by a simple reprimand, no matter how sharp it was. But there was no denying it. Things had changed. The tone in the room had shifted. As the trial continued, the defense lawyer tried his best to focus on the task at hand. He had to put the disagreement behind him, even if it still lingered in his mind. His client was counting on him, and the last thing he needed was for personal frustration to get in the way of the case. He knew how important this trial was, not just for his client, but for the larger implications it carried. The stakes were high, but it wasn't easy to shake off what had just happened. Every time he raised his hand to speak or leaned in to make a point, he felt the weight of the judge's earlier words pressing on him. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about pride, about respect. He knew that he couldn't allow this moment to define the rest of the trial, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that he had been publicly humiliated. Across the room, the judge continued to oversee the trial, though it was clear that his mind was still processing what had happened. He was a professional, a seasoned figure who had spent decades in the courtroom. He had seen lawyers challenge him before, seen them try to push boundaries, but this situation felt different. The defense lawyer's defiance had thrown him off, and it had affected the mood in the courtroom. For the first time that day, the judge's authority felt somewhat questioned. He couldn't let that stand. His voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it as he turned his attention to the rest of the room. "Let us proceed," he said, his words carrying the weight of the power he still held. He was back in control, but there was no doubt that the air between him and the defense lawyer was charged with tension. Everyone in the room could feel it. As the prosecution side of the case continued, the defense lawyer struggled to maintain his focus. He was trying to listen, trying to stay engaged, but his mind kept wandering back to the interaction with the judge. He replayed the moment over and over in his head, wondering if he had been too bold, too quick to speak up. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had a right to stand his ground. He wasn't a rookie. He was an experienced lawyer. He knew the game, and he knew how to argue. It wasn't about disrespecting the court. It was about doing his job. Was that so wrong? He glanced over at his colleagues seated in the back of the courtroom and caught a few nervous glances in return. They had all been watching when the confrontation happened, and it was clear that they too felt the awkwardness in the air. Some of them were shaking their heads, others were quietly murmuring to each other. The defense lawyer could tell that the room was divided. Some might side with the judge, thinking he was right to assert control. Others, perhaps, would sympathize with the defense lawyer, understanding that he was just doing his job. But none of that mattered now. The trial had to move forward, and his role was to ensure that his client had the best possible defense. He had to get past the moment with the judge. He just had to. The next few hours passed in a blur. The defense lawyer tried his best to block out the tension, to ignore the faint sound of whispers in the courtroom, and focus on the case. He made his arguments with the same precision he always did, though there was a subtle shift in his tone, just enough to suggest that something was different now. He was more careful with his words, more conscious of how he presented his points. It was as if the entire room was watching him now, waiting for him to make another mistake. The prosecution, meanwhile, seemed to be feeding off the energy in the room. They sensed the shift, too. They could see the crack in the defense lawyer's confidence, the way he hesitated just a little longer before making his arguments. The prosecutor, an experienced attorney with a knack for reading the room, subtly played on this shift. He kept his tone steady, his words calculated, and he subtly pushed the narrative that the defense lawyer was now on the back foot. The defense lawyer could feel it. The way the prosecutor's words seemed to hang in the air, the way he pressed his case with increasing confidence. It was clear that the prosecutor knew that the defense lawyer was rattled. And in the world of law, even the slightest hint of uncertainty could change the entire course of a trial. But the defense lawyer wasn't about to give up. He couldn't afford to. He had worked too hard for this moment. The stakes were too high. He had to find a way to regain control. His mind began to race. The courtroom, with its cold walls and heavy atmosphere, seemed to close in on him. He knew that the longer he let this tension linger, the harder it would be to recover. He had to act. He had to show that he was still in charge, that he wasn't going to let the judge's reprimand or the prosecutor's subtle jabs knock him off course. In a sudden burst of clarity, he stood up. His decision was made in a split second. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He would use it to his advantage, to show the court and the judge that he wasn't someone to be easily intimidated. With a deep breath, he stood, his body straightening as he faced the judge once more. The room went silent again, everyone waiting to see what he would do next. The judge, sensing the shift, turned his attention back to the defense lawyer. "What is it?" the judge asked, his voice firm yet still carrying a hint of uncertainty. Was the lawyer about to argue again? Would there be another confrontation? The defense lawyer paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then in a calm but steady voice, he addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, "I understand the importance of following the rules in this courtroom. I know the value of respect, and I respect this court. But I must also say that as an officer of the court, my duty is to my client. I'm here to advocate for them, and I must do that to the best of my ability." He paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom was still, all eyes on him. The defense lawyer could feel the weight of the judge's gaze, but he stood his ground. "I apologize if my words earlier seemed disrespectful," he continued. "That was not my intention. But I must remind this court that it is my duty to speak on behalf of my client, and sometimes that means challenging what is presented before us." The judge sat quietly for a moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. He was listening carefully now, taking in the defense lawyer's words. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a recognition perhaps that the lawyer wasn't just being defiant for the sake of it. The defense lawyer was passionate, committed to his client, and had a point to make. The judge, despite the earlier tension, seemed to respect that. With a slow nod, the judge spoke again, this time his tone softer. "I appreciate your words," he said. "But remember, you will follow the rules of this courtroom. We will proceed with order." The defense lawyer nodded respectfully, relieved that the tension between them had been somewhat diffused. The courtroom was still heavy with the aftertaste of the earlier clash, but it seemed that they could move forward, carefully now with all eyes watching, for now. The battle for control of the courtroom had shifted, and the trial would go on. But everyone in the room knew that things would never be quite the same again. The line had been drawn, and both the defense lawyer and the judge were aware of it. The trial was far from over, and the stakes had just gotten even higher. The tension in the courtroom hung thick in the air, but for a brief moment it seemed like everything was moving forward again. The defense lawyer, though still simmering from the earlier exchange with the judge, had managed to gather himself. His words had struck a chord with the judge, who had softened slightly, and for the time being the trial continued without any further confrontations. The lawyer knew he had to keep his head in the game, and he did, presenting his case with the same sharpness he had always prided himself on. His mind, however, was still replaying the earlier moment, how easily everything had almost spiraled out of control. But then, something happened that no one had expected, least of all the defense lawyer. The judge had just made a ruling on a minor procedural issue when a hushed murmur began to ripple through the room. It started at the back of the courtroom and spread like wildfire, so subtle at first that it was almost unnoticeable. Some people in the gallery exchanged quick, curious glances. Some of the lawyers at the defense table shifted in their seats. Something was different, but no one could immediately put their finger on it. The judge, still seated at the front, raised his brow as he noticed the murmurs. He paused, waiting for the noise to subside before he addressed the room again. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice sharp, expecting someone to speak up. One of the court clerks, looking a bit flustered, stepped forward and leaned toward the judge, speaking in a low voice that only he could hear. Whatever was said seemed to hit the judge like a bolt of lightning. His face shifted from calm authority to an almost imperceptible look of surprise. His eyes widened just slightly, but he quickly masked it. Pulling himself together, he gave a nod to the clerk, who retreated just as quickly as she had approached. The judge straightened up, his usual composure returning in an instant. There was a brief moment of silence in the courtroom as everyone waited for what was to come next. The defense lawyer, still in his seat, couldn't help but notice the judge's change in demeanor. He glanced around, sensing the shift in the room. His gut instinct told him that something big was about to happen, though he had no idea what. The judge, who had just moments ago seemed perfectly in control, now had an air of uncertainty about him. For the first time in the trial, the judge looked slightly uneasy. It was subtle, but anyone who had been paying attention could see that something had changed. Then, without any warning, the judge turned his gaze to the defense lawyer. His voice was suddenly quieter, more deliberate. "Counselor, may I ask you a question?" The lawyer, slightly taken aback by the sudden shift, nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." "Tell me," the judge continued, his tone now measured and calm, "what is your role in this case exactly?" The defense lawyer felt the question was strange, but he answered it anyway, still focused on maintaining his composure. "I am representing the defendant, Your Honor, as his attorney." The judge paused. His eyes narrowed as if something important had just clicked in his mind. A beat passed before he spoke again. "You're the Attorney General for the state, are you not?" he asked, his voice now a little less steady, a little more uncertain. The courtroom fell dead silent. The defense lawyer froze. His heart skipped a beat. There was a brief moment where it seemed like time itself had come to a halt. Did the judge really just say that? The Attorney General? Was that the mistake the judge had made earlier? Was he realizing it now? The defense lawyer's mind raced as the weight of the question began to settle. "No, Your Honor," the lawyer replied, a slight confusion in his voice. "I'm not the Attorney General." But there was something in the judge's face, a flicker of recognition, a shift that suggested that the judge had just realized what was happening. The judge's face changed, and for the first time his composed exterior cracked slightly. He looked toward the back of the courtroom, where a few of the other attorneys were now looking at him with wide eyes. The whispers began again, louder this time, as if the entire room was waking up to the reality of what had just unfolded. The judge quickly turned his gaze back to the defense lawyer, the confusion turning into something else, something that was both realization and regret. The judge cleared his throat, visibly flustered now. "I've just been informed that you are, in fact, the state's Attorney General." The words hung in the air like a weighty silence. The defense lawyer could feel his face flush with a mix of embarrassment and confusion. He wasn't sure if the judge was trying to cover up his mistake, or if the judge had genuinely misunderstood the situation all along. "No, Your Honor," the defense lawyer repeated, trying to keep his voice even. "I am not the Attorney General. I'm just a regular defense attorney here for my client." The realization hit the judge like a ton of bricks. He had been scolding, reprimanding, and even threatening someone who wasn't just any lawyer. He was someone at the very top of the state's legal hierarchy. The judge had not only reprimanded the defense lawyer for interrupting, but he had done so without knowing that this person had more power, more authority, and more influence than almost anyone else in that courtroom. The judge had just made a massive mistake, and everyone in the room could feel the shift as it unfolded. The murmur of disbelief spread like wildfire. It was impossible not to feel the shock ripple through the room. Even the most experienced lawyers in the gallery were shaking their heads, exchanging looks of surprise. How had the judge not realized it? How had this simple misunderstanding turned into such a spectacle? The defense lawyer, though initially flustered, now took a deep breath, choosing to remain calm. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but this was something completely unexpected. He wasn't just defending his client anymore. He was trying to manage the fallout of a huge courtroom gaffe. The judge, visibly flustered, adjusted his glasses and sat back in his chair. He cleared his throat again, struggling to regain his composure in front of the room. He began, then stopped, collecting his thoughts. I see there has been a misunderstanding. The room was still, all eyes now fixed on the judge. The air had changed. No one knew how to proceed, least of all the judge. He had never been caught in such a public error before. His reputation for being tough and in control had just taken a serious hit. The defense lawyer had been wronged, and now everyone in the room could see the shift in power dynamics. The defense lawyer wasn't just any attorney. He was someone who held a crucial, powerful position within the state's legal system. The judge finally managed to speak again, though his words were measured and careful. I sincerely apologize for the confusion, he said, his voice steady but lacking the usual confidence it had carried earlier in the trial. It was not my intention to disrespect you. The defense lawyer, though he could feel the weight of the apology, simply nodded. He wasn't here for personal apologies. His focus was still on the case at hand, but the damage had been done. The courtroom had witnessed an embarrassing blunder from the judge, and though the judge tried to backtrack and correct his mistake, it would be hard to erase the memory of the public confrontation. And so, as the proceedings continued, the atmosphere had changed forever. The judge's error had shifted the entire dynamic of the trial. No longer could the judge maintain his usual air of unquestioned authority. Everyone in the courtroom knew now what had seemed like a simple mistake had just turned into a turning point in the trial. It would be hard to undo the impression it had left. For the defense lawyer, though, it was clear. He had managed to regain his ground. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, he had been able to maintain his professionalism, and that had, in some ways, restored his control over the trial. But how this would affect the case going forward, no one knew. The courtroom, though, had just witnessed something no one would forget. The courtroom had become a battlefield, but it wasn't one of loud arguments or dramatic outbursts anymore. It had shifted to something subtler, a quiet tension that simmered beneath the surface. The earlier exchange between the defense lawyer and the judge had already made its mark, and the energy in the room had changed, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. The defense lawyer, though visibly rattled by the judge's mistake, kept his composure. He had been through tough cases before, but nothing quite like this. He knew the importance of staying calm, of not letting a single mistake, especially one that wasn't his own, ruin the course of the trial. But there was no denying it. The events of the last few minutes had altered the flow of the case. He could feel the weight of the room's attention on him, the way everyone was now watching closely to see how he would handle the situation. As the judge tried to recover from his blunder, his tone softened a little. He was clearly uncomfortable, and the defense lawyer could tell that the judge was doing his best to maintain control over the proceedings. There was something almost apologetic in the judge's posture, as though he was desperately trying to regain the authority that had slipped through his fingers. "Let's move forward, shall we?" the judge said, his voice quieter than before, the confidence in it no longer as firm. He cleared his throat, a nervous tick that hadn't been there before. "I trust we can proceed without further interruptions." The defense lawyer nodded, though his mind was still processing what had just happened. It was strange. The judge had apologized, yes, but the damage had already been done. The room had seen it all. The mistake was in the air now, hanging over everything. The defense lawyer knew this wasn't just going to disappear. The judge's misstep was going to be something that the media would latch onto. It would be discussed, dissected, and analyzed for days to come. This was far from the calm, controlled trial it had been just a few hours ago. The rest of the trial, however, didn't slow down. The prosecution took the opportunity to press forward, seizing the slight vulnerability that had been created in the courtroom. They launched into their next argument with renewed intensity, their voices sharp and full of purpose. They were not going to let the earlier chaos derail their momentum. The defense lawyer, though, was no longer just defending his client's case. He had to defend his own standing in the courtroom, too. It was like balancing on a tightrope now. Every move, every word was measured. He had to stay sharp, stay in control, even if everything inside him wanted to let the frustration out. But as he listened to the prosecution's arguments, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been too quiet, too passive. Should he have been more aggressive in pushing back? Should he have fought harder for his position after the judge's mistake? The questions swirled in his mind, but he knew that dwelling on them wouldn't help now. He had to stay focused. His client needed him, and that was what mattered most. The defense lawyer's eyes flicked to his client, who sat quietly in the defendant's seat, looking anxious but hopeful. It wasn't just the lawyer's own reputation at stake, it was his client's future. The gravity of the situation hit him with a renewed force. His job wasn't just to win this case, it was to protect someone's life, someone's future. And with the eyes of the courtroom still on him, he had to do it with grace. Even though the odds had suddenly shifted against him, the judge, still attempting to regain the upper hand, tried to steer the proceedings back to normalcy. His voice, though still a little unsteady, was getting stronger again. Let's move on to the next issue. Prosecution, you may continue. The defense lawyer, now on alert, straightened up in his seat, ready to pick up where he had left off. But as the prosecution began presenting their evidence, something strange happened. The tension that had been lingering in the courtroom seemed to thicken, like the air had been charged with something electric. The defense lawyer's instincts, honed over years of experience, told him that something wasn't right. The case wasn't unfolding as it should. The prosecution was throwing in a new angle, a new piece of evidence that hadn't been introduced before. It felt like a sudden shift in the wind, a change that could potentially derail everything. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes as the prosecution presented a new witness, someone who had been called to the stand unexpectedly. The defense lawyer had heard rumors of this person, but he hadn't anticipated their appearance today. This witness was someone who could change the entire narrative of the trial. And as the witness began speaking, it became clear that this was a game changer. The witness's testimony was precise, detailed, and incredibly damaging to the defense's case. The defense lawyer could feel his heart race as he listened to the words that were being spoken. This person had information, critical information, that the defense hadn't accounted for. It was like a bomb had gone off in the courtroom, and the shockwaves were rippling through the entire room. For a moment, the defense lawyer struggled to keep his focus. He had been blindsided. This new witness wasn't just someone with minor information. They were a key figure who could undermine the entire defense. The prosecution had clearly held on to this card until the right moment, waiting for the trial to reach its peak before dropping this bombshell. The courtroom was silent as the witness finished their testimony. The defense lawyer glanced at his client, whose face had gone pale. The expression in their eyes mirrored his own feelings of disbelief. This wasn't just a setback, it was a blow to the entire defense strategy. The defense lawyer took a deep breath. He had been here before, dealing with last-minute surprises, unexpected turns of events. He couldn't let this shake him. He had to think fast, and he had to think clear. The trial wasn't over. Not yet. The judge, who had been following the testimony closely, seemed to sense the shift in the room. His eyes lingered on the defense lawyer for a moment, and the lawyer could almost feel the weight of the judge's gaze. It was as though the judge was silently asking, "What are you going to do now?" The defense lawyer stood up, his mind spinning with questions but his feet moving with purpose. This was the moment where he would have to regroup, to regain control of the situation. The prosecution had made its move, but now it was his turn to react. His response needed to be measured, calm, but powerful. He had to show that even in the face of unexpected evidence, he wasn't backing down. "Your Honor," the defense lawyer said, his voice steady as he addressed the court, "I would like to request a recess to review this new testimony and discuss it with my client. This is a significant shift in the case, and we need time to properly assess the impact it will have." The judge, though clearly still uneasy from earlier, nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice still carrying a hint of hesitation. "We will reconvene in 1 hour." The defense lawyer returned to his seat, his mind racing as he met his client's eyes. He could see the worry on their face, but there was something else too. Something like a flicker of hope. It wasn't over. Not yet. He wasn't going to let this new twist break him. He had been in tough situations before, and he had come out on top. This wasn't the first time he'd been blindsided, and it wouldn't be the last. But he couldn't let this unexpected witness destroy everything he had worked for. He had 1 hour to figure out how to turn this situation around. As the courtroom began to empty for the break, the defense lawyer walked out, his steps quick and purposeful. The weight of what had just happened was starting to sink in, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had a job to do. The clock was ticking, and in 1 hour everything could change. The hour-long recess seemed to stretch on forever. The defense lawyer walked out of the courtroom, his mind a whirl of thoughts. He knew this wasn't just any trial. This wasn't just a case of defending a client. This was about protecting everything he had built over his career. The unexpected witness, the one who had just turned the tide of the trial, was a huge challenge. They had just dropped a bombshell, and now the defense lawyer had to figure out how to defuse it. His client sat silently beside him, their face pale, eyes wide with concern. He could feel the tension radiating from them. It was clear that the revelation of the new testimony had shaken their faith in the case. The defense lawyer wasn't sure what to say. He couldn't promise them that everything would be okay, but he knew that he couldn't give up. "Not now. Let's go somewhere quiet," he said softly to his client, his voice firm yet reassuring. He needed to clear his mind and think through their next move. The courtroom, with its oppressive silence and expectant eyes, wasn't the place for him to think clearly. They walked down the hallway and into a small, dimly lit conference room. The defense lawyer shut the door behind them and leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. His client sat at the table, their hands folded nervously in front of them. "Okay," the defense lawyer began, his voice calm but with an edge of determination. "Let's break this down." The new witness had thrown a serious wrench into their defense. The witness had detailed information that could unravel the entire case. The defense lawyer didn't know how they had obtained such knowledge, but he suspected it was something carefully orchestrated by the prosecution. They had been holding on to this person for the right moment, and now that moment had arrived. "What do you think?" his client asked, breaking the silence. Their voice was small, filled with doubt. "Do we still have a chance?" The defense lawyer paused. He didn't have a quick answer. In all his years of handling difficult cases, he had never faced a twist like this. He was good at reading people, reading situations. But this one? This was a challenge on a whole new level. He took a moment to think before responding. "We can still win this," he said, his voice steady. "But we need to think strategically. We can't let this witness's testimony destroy everything we've built. We need to challenge their credibility, find weaknesses in their story. We'll figure it out." His client didn't look convinced, but they nodded. They were relying on him to find a way out of this, and he wasn't about to let them down. The defense lawyer could feel the weight of the responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He had promised his client that he would fight for them, and he was determined to keep that promise, no matter how hard the battle became. The minutes ticked by as the defense lawyer reviewed the case notes and trial documents. The key to turning this around lay in finding something, anything that could discredit the witness or their testimony. He flipped through pages looking for inconsistencies, discrepancies, or anything that could give him an opening. Then, something caught his eye. A small detail, buried deep within the witness's background. Something that hadn't seemed significant at first glance, but now felt like the thread he needed to pull. The witness had claimed to have direct knowledge of certain events. However, there was a gap in the timeline, a window where their account didn't quite line up with the facts. The defense lawyer's mind began to race. If he could prove that the witness's memory was faulty, that their version of events was unreliable, it could significantly weaken the prosecution's case. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build on, enough to create doubt. "We've got something," he said, sitting up straighter. He looked at his client, who was still looking uncertain but now paying closer attention. "There's a gap in their timeline. If we can show that the witness wasn't where they said they were, it could discredit their entire testimony." His client's eyes widened, and for the first time since the witness's testimony, a flicker of hope appeared on their face. "You really think so?" "I do," the defense lawyer replied. "It's not foolproof, but it's a start. We just need to dig into it more, make sure we have all the evidence we need." The two of them spent the next few minutes running through the new strategy, the defense lawyer outlining their next steps. He would need to gather additional records, interview people who could verify the timeline, and possibly even challenge the witness's credibility in front of the court. The task ahead wasn't easy, but it was a path forward. And that was all that mattered now. The break was almost over. The defense lawyer stood up, straightening his jacket. His client followed suit, looking a little less anxious, but still holding on to that doubt. The lawyer placed a hand on their shoulder, offering a small smile. "We're not out of this yet," he said. "Let's go back in there and do what we do best." They walked back toward the courtroom, the air outside feeling different, almost electric. There was no denying that the trial had taken an unexpected turn, but the defense lawyer could feel the determination building inside him. He had faced harder challenges before, and he had come through them. This wouldn't be the one to break him. When they entered the courtroom again, all eyes were on them. The judge looked up from his bench, and the quiet murmur of the gallery settled as everyone awaited the next step. The prosecution sat across the room, their faces unreadable, their witness still present at the stand, waiting for the next phase of the trial. The defense lawyer took a deep breath and walked up to his client's side, ready to face whatever came next. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. He had to be careful, calculated, and precise. There were no more chances for error. The judge called the room to order, and the defense lawyer stood up once again. His heart was pounding, his mind was racing, but he had a renewed sense of clarity. The trial was far from over, but he now had the one thing that had been missing: a strategy. A way to fight back. And he wasn't about to waste it. "Your Honor," the defense lawyer began, his voice steady and strong, "I would like to revisit the testimony provided by the prosecution's witness. After reviewing the facts, I have reason to believe that there are significant discrepancies in their account of events." The prosecutor's face twitched slightly, and the witness glanced nervously at the defense lawyer. It was clear that the defense was about to challenge them. The witness was about to be put under the microscope, and the prosecution had to know that this wasn't going to be an easy ride anymore. The judge leaned forward, clearly interested. "Go ahead, counselor. Present your evidence." The defense lawyer took a deep breath, knowing that this moment was crucial. He had to make this count. He had to show the court that the witness's testimony wasn't as reliable as it seemed. If he could plant enough doubt, the case would take a completely different direction. The defense lawyer began to present the evidence, slowly, methodically, each point building upon the last. He showed that the timeline the witness had provided was inaccurate, that the details they had given didn't line up with records that were available. The room was silent, save for the sound of his voice as he systematically picked apart the witness's testimony. As he spoke, he could see the prosecution growing tense, their earlier confidence starting to slip. The judge listened closely, his eyes narrowing as the defense lawyer continued to make his case. The defense lawyer knew he was being watched closely, not just by the judge but by everyone in the room. This was it, the pivotal moment in the trial. His every word counted. After what felt like hours, but was really only minutes, the defense lawyer finished. He took a step back, allowing the weight of what he had just presented to settle in the room. The silence was thick. The judge shifted in his seat, and the prosecution began to confer quietly with each other. The defense lawyer didn't know whether the tide had truly turned in their favor, but he had done everything he could. Now it was up to the court to decide whether the witness's testimony could withstand the scrutiny.